certaines valeurs de la sunna, amener le djihad, donner une certaine légitimité, on va dire, à Boko Haram. C'était une forme de sincérité, entre guillemets, de Boko Haram actions. Cette sincérité-là, malgré tout, dans ses actions, va avoir un impact sur les différents groupes sociaux que je viens d'évoquer tout à l'heure, les aînés et puis les femmes. De toutes les façons, le djihad, tel qu'il est défini, allait faire des victimes. Le djihad a une connotation polysémique. Je tiens un peu à le préciser parce que ça me permet de comprendre pourquoi ça va avoir un impact psychologique. C'est que, bon, on dit tout le temps que le djihad, c'est ça. Mais le djihad a une notion finalement. Et bon, qu'on l'utilise chaque fois à des fins, on l'adapte, et ainsi de suite. Je voudrais par exemple préciser que dans le Coran, il existe 35 versets où apparaît le mot djihad. Et dans ces 35 versets, on en a 22 où s'applique, qui en fait connotent l'effort de guerre, l'effort en général, j'allais dire. Et puis 10 versets qui connotent la guerre proprement dite. Et seulement 3 versets qui connotent la spiritualité. Je veux donc dire que c'est une notion qui est malléable à souhait. Et dans les règles de ce djihad-là, il y a un droit qui stipule, on peut dire qu'il y a quand même un certain nombre de règles qui sont établies, qui relèvent donc de ce qu'on appelle le droit islamique pour la pratique même du djihad. Et donc, les règles de protection de civils, comme on les appelle, stipulent que le combattant du djihad doit être de sexe masculin, pubère, sain d'esprit, libre, exempt de défauts et désintéressé. Je ne vais pas peut-être rentrer dans les détails pour expliquer ce que ça veut dire être libre, exempt de défauts, ainsi de suite. Mais en gros, cette définition-là veut dire que ceux qui doivent mener ce djihad-là, c'est en bref ces jeunes de cette tranche d'âge que je viens de citer, et précisément les hommes, sachant que les femmes ne font pas partie de la définition. Par conséquent, je vais y aller rapidement pour dire que si on comprend, on voit un peu cette définition même de la notion du djihad, cette compréhension qui a été brandie par Boko Haram pour entamer son prosélytisme, on va dire. On voit déjà que les jeunes peuvent être des victimes dans la mesure où ils sont appelés à suivre un guide, à honorer un devoir pour lequel ils sont plus ou moins convaincus et pour lesquels ils ont quand même une certaine peur dès l'origine. Mais pourquoi pas essayer? Donc, quelque part, et c'est déjà une première dimension psychologique de la violence, on peut dire. Pour les femmes, la compréhension même de ceux qui menaient le djihad selon cette définition, et qu'il était important de revenir sur cette petite définition du djihad, c'est que les femmes sont très clairement reléguées au rang des ignorantes parce qu'elles ne participent pas à ce djihad-là, peu importe leur âge, leur degré de validité, leur état mental. Les femmes ne participent donc pas à ce djihad et sont très clairement reléguées au rang d'ignorantes, d'impertinentes, alors même que la société, avec les politiques féministes, commence à leur certaine place au niveau de la société. Et donc, lorsque le mouvement de Boko Haram commence, ça relègue en quelque sorte les femmes à ce rang-là. Je rappelle qu'à l'émergence, les femmes, étaient, Boko Haram, c'était dans la ville de Maïdougouri. Toujours-il que déjà voir les prémices d'une certaine violence qui met en fait en place une certaine psychose. Le deuxième moment où la violence ou bien l'état d'esprit ou le choc, le trauma s'installe, et c'est le plus palpable, c'est au moment où Boko Haram passe à partir de 2009, comme on le sait tous, avec de Youssouf. En 2009, après, quand les actions de Boko Haram vont basculer vers les attaques véritablement terroristes, les scènes macabres, ainsi de suite, tout le monde va être témoin, en quelque sorte, des assassinats, de la façon dont les gens sont assassinés, la mise en scène qu'il y a, les villages brûlés, les femmes qui vont se retrouver toutes seules, qui vont perdre époux, parents, enfants, d'une façon ou d'une autre, qui vont se retrouver à fuir leur village, à marcher des jours et des nuits, à chercher à se recaser. Et quelque part, tant bien que mal. Les vieux qui finalement sont épargnés vont se retrouver seuls à vivre ces scènes d'horreur-là parce qu'ils ne peuvent pas fuir et ils ne sont pas non plus tués par Boko Haram et ils sont laissés par Boko Haram pour jouer en fait le rôle de pompe funèbre. Et donc, vous imaginez un peu les scènes qu'ils peuvent être contraints de vivre tout en restant dans cet environnement-là de façon presque obligatoire et de jouer plus tard le rôle de renseignement, d'agent de renseignement pour Boko Haram qui pourrait éventuellement revenir leur demander ce qu'il en a été après leur premier passage. Et donc, on peut comprendre l'état psychologique de ces vieux-là. Je vais passer rapidement pour dire que après cette autre étape de Boko Haram violente avec ces témoins des violences de Boko Haram, on a cet après Boko Haram de ceux qui se sont déplacés, qui se sont réfugiés, dont on dit avoir été pris en charge. Ceux-là qui se retrouvent dans des camps, et ainsi de suite, vivent aussi une forme de trauma dont on ne parle pas beaucoup et qui, en réalité, sont comme on dit, déconnectés, déboussolés, traumatisés dans tous les sens du terme. Ce que je voudrais dire rapidement, je vais peut-être considérer cela comme ma conclusion, sachant que nous n'avons pas beaucoup de temps, c'est que le traumatisme qu'il y a alors qu'on estime que, bon, les personnes sont maintenant peut-être dans des camps de réfugiés, qui sont placés dans de nouveaux villages, ils se sont éloignés de Boko Haram, ils vivent un autre type de traumatisme qui, pour moi, me semble être peut-être la variable qu'il faut prendre en compte, parce que j'estime que ça pourrait être un autre facteur. C'est qu'on va dire se retrouver seul alors qu'on est une femme et qu'on se rend compte que non, mais à la fin, on se demande pourquoi on a été épargné et qu'on vous dit que vous ne valez vraiment rien, que vous ne pouvez rien faire de toutes les façons on vous laisse. C'est assez choquant. C'est vrai, même si peut-être que dans l'éducation, elles sont déjà formées pour être convaincues qu'elles ne servent pas à grand-chose. Mais ce fait-là, qu'on le leur rappelle, par exemple, c'est quelque chose de particulièrement traumatisant. Il y a la variable religieuse. Je pense qu'il faudrait qu'on prenne en compte au niveau des traumas féminins, le fait que les femmes, qu'on leur dise que c'est au nom de la religion, qu'elles se rendent compte qu'en réalité, depuis qu'elles faisaient confiance à leur époux, leur père et autres qui assuraient en quelque sorte tout ce qui est dans la famille et que finalement on assassine ces personnes-là, qu'elles se retrouvent véritablement seules. Le fait de se retrouver inutile, ne pas connaître ces variables religieuses-là, envisager un avenir et avoir perdu son enfant, est-ce que finalement ce ne sont pas des formes de retardement, la psychologie? Les vieux, je chute par là pour dire que les vieux qui sont abandonnés, je relève qu'il y a un certain nombre de mesures d'accompagnement qui sont prises pour ces états d'esprit-là. Mais les vieux en général, quand je dis les vieux, bon, c'est peut-être péjoratif, mais les personnes seniors qui ont été épargnées par Boko Haram ou qui n'ont pas pu fuir, qui sont abandonnées dans des villages, qui en réalité ne parlent même plus beaucoup, sont dans un certain mutisme, ne sont considérés ni par l'État et ni finalement par Boko Haram qui vit dans ces contrées reculées-là, qui ont joué le rôle des pompes funèbres, qui ont vu des scènes macabres, ainsi de suite. On ne tient pas compte d'eux. Et finalement, ça reste aussi des formes de bombes à retardement. Je vais chuter là. On aura certainement l'occasion de peut-être d'échanger davantage. Je sais que c'est assez décousu, mais bon, les circonstances font que ça soit effectivement assez décousu, mais je pense qu'on peut rafistoler ça à partir de tout ce qui a été dit depuis 2 jours déjà. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup pour la présentation très intéressante et parfaitement dans les 15 minutes. Félicitations. Alors maintenant, dans le programme, il y a la présentation de Scott MacEachern de la Duke Kunshan University. Est-ce qu'on va voir les vidéos maintenant ou on avance avec la prochaine présentation? Bon. Les vidéos, si les vidéos n'est pas prêtes, on peut avancer. Oui, mais il faut le PowerPoint de toute façon. Bon, oui. Alors, bientôt, on va... Oui, bientôt, on va avancer. OK, on va voir la vidéo. Alors, parfait. Merci.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott MacEachern, and I'm very pleased to be participating in this conference, although I do wish that I was attending in person in Cameroon and so able to speak to you all more directly. These kinds of recorded presentations are always a little awkward to undertake, so I'll beg your forbearance and I'll begin right away. The kings of the Sudan sell their people for no reason and quite apart from any wars. The Lake Chad Basin was well known as a source of enslaved people through the millennium after Al-Yaqubi wrote about the rulers of Kanem in the 9th century AD, with a formal slave trade only ending late in the 19th century. This region had no equivalent to the gold fields of West Africa, so that the trafficking of enslaved humans has played a central role in regional analyses of state development, most of which have been based upon historical sources. However, the term slavery itself is complex and open to multiple understandings. It seems inadequate to encompass the variety of systems of domination and coercion encountered in the region in the recent past: chattel and war slavery, sexual enslavement and forced marriage, child servitude, capture and forced labor in egalitarian communities, and so on. It's likely that such diverse forms of domination and coercion have always characterized the socio-political environments of the region, and explanations of the dynamics of political evolution probably should take this diversity into account. Al-Yaqubi's statement quoted above is in different parts definite and ambiguous. He says on the one hand that the rulers of Kanem sold enslaved humans to the inhabitants of Zawila in the south-central Sahara, from which they were traded to the Maghreb and to Egypt. And there's slightly later corroborating documentary evidence of that. At the same time, he says that such enslaved peoples were sold for no reason and without even the motivation of warfare. However, the scale of the trade itself make it likely both that some degree of conflict was involved and that the trade involved particular groups of people in some ways socially and or spatially marginal to the Kanem polity itself, as would be the case in later periods. This vagueness may, of course, also be due to the fact that Al-Yaqubi had no first-hand knowledge of the circumstances in which people were enslaved in the Lake Chad Basin, writing as he did from Egypt. That distinction would characterize the next millennium in the region. Our knowledge of the non-Muslim populations that were the most important communities subject to enslavement is often absent, fragmentary, or caricatured, even when the spatial distances between these groups is insignificant. In the Mandara Mountains of Cameroon and Nigeria, for example, we have less information about non-Muslim populations during World War I than was available for neighboring Islamic states 300 years before that, even though the physical distance between these groups is only a few kilometers. In European accounts of the early 20th century, as Barry Sharp says of northern Nigeria, pagan, quote unquote, that is non-Muslim tribes, again, in quotation, had taken on quite distinct characteristics. They were conceived as territorially discrete, politically peripheral, economically isolated, and impoverished in comparison with the central districts of the Emirates or of states more generally. Archaeology may possibly provide an alternative perspective. I am an archaeologist. Not on enslavement itself, because direct archaeological traces of slavery are very rare, but rather evidence of the transformations in social and political relations that both catalyzed and reflected enslavement. These transformations appear to have been gradual, associated with processes of increasing super-regional interactions that accelerated during the late first millennium AD, after centuries where the region around Lake Chad seems to have been more isolated from Saharan and trans-Saharan contacts. These transformations are evident in an increase in exotic artifacts from outside the region, found in the first case in graves after about AD 800 and subsequently more widely. The domesticated equid remains, small horses or ponies, from the Isa Dugje site in northern Cameroon dating to the same period, in the late first millennium AD, are among the first horses known in West Africa. Until breeding populations were established, they would have been constituted an important trade good in and of themselves. Horses would also, of course, be central to the development of political hierarchies and to slave raiding in the region over the subsequent 1,000 years. There's also contemporary evidence of significant population shifts in the region, including the first signs of settlement in the Mandara Mountains and the progressive abandonment of pre-existing Iron Age sites in areas of the Lake Chad Plains vulnerable to attacks by mounted raiders. The archaeological evidence thus indicates a set of changes beginning about a millennium ago that might plausibly be associated with the spread of enslavement as a central social and political fact in the lands around Lake Chad. At the same time, this account is not tremendously satisfactory because it treats enslavement as a simple unitary concept. Slave raiding spreads through the region. Some people are captured and enslaved with varying destinies. Targeted communities flee to defensible terrain, assimilate, or are dispersed. This may be inevitable, since enslavement in the region involved the imposition of new identities, both upon the enslaved people themselves and upon non-Muslim populations as a whole. Derogatory terms like Kirdi, Yalna, Habe, Madikam, used by Muslims around Lake Chad to designate non-Muslim groups and individuals, also carry very distinct associations with enslavement. The mapping of the Muslim, quote, pagan, unquote, dichotomy on the cultural landscape has been hard to avoid. At the same time, there are many indications that the actual situation could be far more complex than this, both in terms of states engaging with populations theoretically enslavable, and in the ways in which people who were actually subservient navigated that subservient status. Thus, for example, in the Bagirmi state, wives of the rulers and of members of his court served as, quote, doors, conduits of information and of representation by diverse communities and ethnic groups across the state. This practice appears to date to the 18th century, if not earlier, and it sometimes involved structured relations, including marriage, between Muslim and non-Muslim groups. We must also note the gendered aspect of this relationship, with women serving as intermediaries between more marginal groups and the court. Among the Wandala, closer to the Mandara Mountains, the ruler served as the leader of a court that included within its hierarchy representatives from other ethnic groups, including non-Muslim populations that would have, in theory and sometimes in practice, been subjected to slave raids. Wandala elite women in some cases married local non-Muslim leaders, as for example when members of the court were forced to move into mountain areas to escape the attacks of the Sudanic slave raider Rabe at the end of the 19th century. There is some evidence for similar roles in the pre-jihad Hausa states and for the smaller Fulani polities of northern Adamawa. Similarly, Wandala and Bagirmi were both centers for the production of eunuchs in the 18th and 19th centuries. Eunuchs and slave soldiers were important elements in state functioning throughout the Lake Chad Basin and could in some cases attain significant power and freedom of action, including their own ownership of slaves. The names of powerful individuals fulfilling these roles are well known in the historiography of the region. It's also true, of course, that members of these groups, the functioning of which has attracted a good deal of attention in the scholarly literature, would have been far outnumbered by the field, urban, and domestic slaves that in some places and times made up a very significant proportion of regional populations. When commentators talk about slavery in the Lake Chad Basin, they're mostly describing the end results of what we might call chattel slavery, with humans enslaved in the course of warfare or specialized slave raiding, usually by state-level societies. There may be disagreements about the exact functioning or implications of these slave systems, but there's pretty general agreement that these are the kinds of statuses under consideration. However, this ignores the diversity of other circumstances in which humans could be reduced into other forms of servitude, in many cases with different kinds of consequences. There is thus abundant evidence for different forms of unfree labor existing in the non-Muslim and variably, quote, egalitarian societies that were themselves the targets of slave raiding from Islamic states. In highly stressed environments, this often took the form of captive taking during feuds or other forms of conflict. There's never been a systematic study of this practice in the region, although reference to captives among these groups occurs very frequently in the ethnographic and historical literature. The circumstances of this status could vary considerably. In many cases, such captives were sold to traders from neighboring Islamic states, although this was by no means always true. In circumstances where captives were not sold, they were frequently incorporated into local systems of labor. Thus, Pontier notes that before the Fulani conquest, it does not seem that the Giziga people living to the east of the Mandarin Mountains knew slavery. At least they did not consider slaves as marketable products. The captives brought back from the war expeditions were not sold. Those who were not killed had to work in the fields of the chief and the nobles for a more or less long period of time. Then they were released or killed. The latter bald statement that captives after labor could be freed or simply killed seems very different from the logics of enslavement held by the Giziga's Muslim neighbors. Vincent notes similar practices in the small Mafu chiefdoms in the same area east of the Mandarin Mountains. In the Mafu case, labor again took place in the fields of power of the chief of the particular area. Such work was not exclusive to captives, but was shared by Mafu neighborhoods in corvée labor for a certain number of days each year. Across the area more generally, captives were very frequently deployed as this labor in farming. Mats Widgren notes the importance of labor adaptations in the development of intensive terrace agriculture in West Africa, and how in some cases it was connected to the development of the local slave trade. Such land-esque capital investment requires significant labor, which was often in short supply. In and around the Mandarin Mountains south of Lake Chad, it seems likely that the supply of captives could periodically have been a significant supplement in such intensive agricultural systems, albeit at a local scale. Pontier's account for the Giziga suggests a lack of mechanisms to stabilize and institutionalize this captive status, although in other parts of the region, captivity and enslavement seems to have been a recognized social fate, with male captives incorporated into kin groups and working for their captors, as well as in some cases receiving wives from them. Women and children were often directly absorbed into the communities of their captors as low-status wives and adoptees. It's also vital to recognize the gendered aspects of enslavement across the region, both in the larger scale systems of Islamic chattel slavery and the various forms of captivity that existed in non-Muslim societies. For women, the day-to-day risks of kidnapping and capture were probably at least as great as the danger from specific slave raids. Along the edges of the Mandarin Mountains, where women and children did a great deal of the cultivation in mountain edge fields and where women and girls were tasked with fetching water from wells, there was a constant risk of individual and spontaneous kidnapping. Kidnapping and subjection of women seems to have been extremely common in non-Muslim societies as well as Muslim ones, whether this involved reprisals in warfare or feuds, or simply kidnapping for eventual marriage. This is usually noted more or less in passing in monographs written by mostly male researchers who, myself included, have not paid nearly enough attention to the histories of women in the southern Lake Chad Basin. The most complete account of these processes in non-Muslim societies in the region is thus probably that of Madeleine Richard in 1977, writing about the Mada communities of the northeastern Mandarin Mountains. Danger to girls and women included individual kidnapping and resulting forced marriages, which among other things demonstrated the courage and strength of the male kidnapper, as well as the possibility of being captured as the result of intercommunity warfare. There is thus a close relationship between captive status, sexual coercion, which could range from sexual enslavement to eventual acquiescence, and the patriarchal social relations which permeated life in the region and continue to do so. Children play a particularly terrible role in the accounts of domination and coercion in this region. In times of famine, desperate women would In times of famine, desperate families would periodically sell their children into servitude in order to save their lives and to gain the means of support for the rest of the family. It's notable that, even in the 1940s, French colonial officers worried that the adoption of children from impoverished non-Muslim into Muslim families was simply a pretext for such servitude. And I also note that the kidnapping of children into domestic servitude was still an important concern for non-Muslim Montagnard communities when I began to work around the Maroua Mountains in the early 1980s. There are significant continuities between pre-colonial practices of enslavement, coercion, and domination and the present circumstances. For example, the slave raider Hamanyaji operated in the interstices between colonial states less than a century ago. His reign of terror on the western side of the Maroua Mountains is notable in this context for two reasons. First, Hamanyaji operated as a large-scale slave raider after the elimination of slave markets by the colonial powers, and especially Great Britain, which obviously raises questions about the motivations and profits of his slave raiding. What does one do with enslaved people that cannot be sold? And second, his favored captives were young women, which provides a great part of the answer to that question. Captives taken by Hamanyaji were distributed as gifts to his followers. Today, some local populations call Boko Haram Hamaji, the term for slave raiders that traces back directly to Hamanyaji a century ago. The term makes a powerful connection between the wanton brutality and destructiveness of these different forms of coercive violence. The link is even more close than that, however, because like Hamanyaji and with the same motivations, Boko Haram insurgents have regularly targeted young women. Despite the claims of Abubakar Shekau that he would sell captured young women in the marketplace, there's still no slave market today, as there was not in Hamanyaji's time. Instead, these women were provided as wives to the impoverished young men who serve as Boko Haram's foot soldiers. Wives, again, being an inadequate term for this kind of forced sexual enslavement. Other women navigated the intensely patriarchal and violent circumstances of their lives by becoming willing wives of Boko Haram commanders, which replicates the conditions of non-slave and slave female labor that existed in the region in the pre-colonial period. There are no particularly profound conclusions to be drawn from this study. It would appear that our preconceptions about slavery only encompass a part of the complex systems of domination and coercion that existed within the region during the historical period. Enslavement existed within a continuum of forms of domination, which encompassed non-Muslim and, quote, egalitarian communities, as well as Islamic slave-raiding states. The gendered experience of these forms of violence has not been sufficiently explored. And these systems of violence were not erased with the colonial period. The experience of women with Hamanyaji and Boko Haram does not differ substantially from the experience of enslaved women during the last millennium and from the time of al-Yaqubi. Thank you very much.
La présentation s'appelle Coercition, genre et histoire dans les bassins du lac Tchad et a résumé un peu l'évolution des pratiques d'esclavagisme dans la zone du bassin du lac Tchad, de la traite à Koultchoumi Babette de l'université et Maroua qui va nous parler de Terrorism and Visual Violence of Female Body in Social Network.
D'accord. Merci. Oui. Yeah. Et si on changeait de discours? En fait, pour contextualiser, il est question dans le cadre de cette présentation de davantage susciter des débats par les médias, opportunisation de la crise Boko Haram par les femmes, perspective. Il est question de voir autrement la femme dans ces crises de Boko Haram, autre que la victime tant chantée, mais qu'elle a joué un rôle très pertinent en tant qu'actrice ferme dans la crise, mais aussi en tant qu'actrice au niveau de la dynamique même de la crise. On ne peut pas lire la crise Boko Haram en dehors de la femme. La femme est comme le sous-bassement de la dynamique même de la crise Boko Haram et qu'il faudra à un moment donné en parler. Mais ici, c'est avec le plus de médias. On veut mettre la du point de vue des médias. Et les médias, la problématique générale et avec un ancrage sur la violence visuelle exprimée par cette question-là. Donc déjà, l'objectif, comme je l'ai dit, c'est présenter un sous-bassement analytique qui explore la nature non sexo-spécifique du traitement du terrorisme par les médias. Ils sont masculins et prennent à peine compte du terrorisme féminin et au féminin. On a un traitement des informations en contexte de conflit par des hommes qui encouragent les violences visuelles du corps féminin. Donc, le terrorisme entre réalité et stéréotype. Déjà, de réalité, il faut qu'on prenne en compte que la femme a un double visage dans la production de la violence au niveau du bassin du lac Tchad, particulièrement dans la zone sud du lac. C'est là où nous avons travaillé. C'est des parties prenantes et parfois principales protagonistes, complices assumées du terrorisme, faiseuses de bombes et kamikazes, endoctrinent des jeunes sous contrôle de Boko Haram, assurent la survie de l'ami pendant ces périodes de trouble. Donc, elles sont à la fois actrices, mais en même temps de ce doux jeu qui est dans les mouvements de défense de la paix au niveau communautaire à travers les comités de vigilance, mais aussi dans les processus de paix. Donc, en réalité et stéréotype, nous continuons de la virilité des conflits et du terrorisme qui tombe en plus et impose une lecture dans les conflits. Nous avons une gestion par les médias qui considèrent la femme comme victime et vulnérable, qui subissent les conflits et non les produisent. Donc, de nombreuses femmes ont farouché des conflits. Et à partir des dynamiques de nos études, nous avons remarqué que cela. Nous avons aussi une autre considération un nouvel espace de terreur dégradant aussi en la capitalisation des sciences et pour asseoir une nouvelle image de la femme. Donc, que font les médias donc? Violence visuelle du corps féminin. Les médias
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my virtual presentation on social reproduction and female militancy, Boko Haram's female suicide bombers. My name is Shehnoor, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at York University in Toronto, Canada. I'm sad I'm not able to join you in Cameroon, but I'm glad I can still connect with you through Zoom. So to just jump straight into my presentation, conventionally, militarism and terrorism have been considered masculine enterprises, with women's participation regarded as anomalous and atypical. The emergence of female suicide bombers operating for Nigerian militant Islamist movement Boko Haram has challenged these long-held beliefs. Since the escalation of its violence in 2009, Boko Haram has engaged in forced conscription of women and girls through kidnapping and sexual violence. But women have not only just been disproportionately victimized by modern conflicts, they're also playing an increasingly important role in the tactical operations of terrorist groups and insurgencies, as shown in Boko Haram. A study conducted by Warner and MacEachern in 2017 found that over half of all suicide bombers used by Boko Haram were female. Bloom and MacEachern and Zen and Pearson have also found that Boko Haram has used more female suicide bombers than any other group in the region since the beginning of its insurgency in 2009. Some estimates even go so far as to speculate that Boko Haram has kidnapped over 2,000 people since 2014, specifically women and girls, noting that Boko Haram's kidnappings typically are tactical in nature because many of the women are used as weapons of war. So the reason for the increase in female militancy has been an area of inquiry for over a decade, with scholars trying to better understand what role women play in the group and why their membership has been increasing so significantly. Researchers have found that women and girls are exploited by Boko Haram for a number of reasons, and this can be delineated into two camps: those that join forcefully and those that join voluntarily. Within the first category, women are used in operations to attack targets and lure government soldiers, used specifically as suicide bombers. This is because women are able to move through society with relative ease and go undetected. This basically allows them to infiltrate targets, move through checkpoints, bypass military personnel, and do more without raising any suspicion. This allows Boko Haram to employ a strategy of surprise, where female suicide bombers are capable of causing large numbers of fatalities and property damage. And this has happened not just in northern Nigeria, but is now having spillover effects in neighboring countries like Chad and Cameroon. Secondly, women are being used as sexual slaves in militant camps as satisfying insurgents and creating a group loyalty. Bloom and MacEachern in 2016 found that forced marriages serve a very tactical purpose, where the provisioning of women as prizes creates loyalty through enhanced status following marriage. These tactics and treatment of women are also used in the sort of running of the group, where women are made to engage in sexual amusement of men and to cook, clean, do the laundry, and help with the functioning of the actual group. Female militancy is also a propaganda tool that increases intimidation, publicity, and fear, ultimately demonstrating the strength of the group relative to the Nigerian government and military, whose legitimacy, especially in the eyes of the public, has been drastically waning. Lastly, female militants, as Gallahan writes, are cost efficient for the group to use because they're viewed as cheap and expendable commodities that are readily available and can produce, that are relatively easy to obtain and are able to amass large amounts of damage in the form of suicide bombings. So due to the large number of women and girls that they have been able to acquire through kidnappings, abductions, and being donated to the group by parents, Boko Haram has a large supply of potential bombers that are low in cost to train, while not having to use committed members. Female militants are often trained very minimally, drugged prior to the bombing detonation. And so they don't have to sacrifice their sort of well-trained and valuable male members, and instead can rely on female suicide bombers to conduct these tasks. To this conversation, the second group is women who join voluntarily. Bloom and Matthess argue that there are three sort of overarching reasons why women join. A, out of vengeance and retribution. So in particular, widows have been known to join Boko Haram after their spouses have been killed by the Nigerian military or killed more generally in war. Next are economic incentives, where women join Boko Haram or marry Boko Haram militants or donate their daughters to Boko Haram as a means to secure their livelihood. Bloom and Matthess write, in underdeveloped countries, economic growth is linked to women's diminishing share of the labor market, pushing them to join terrorist groups out of desperation. Lastly, women join because of a devotion or commitment to the group's ideology and religious aims. So in sum, there are multiple reasons why women join Boko Haram, and they serve multiple different purposes within the group. Now, a lot of scholars, such as Dara K. Cohen, attribute the emergence of female militants for all of these various purposes as emerging from the unraveling of the social fabric of Nigeria. A majority of the scholars involved point the finger to the deteriorating political, economic, and social context in which destitute poverty has become the norm, which ultimately dehumanizes entire generations of women and girls, creating them as fodder to be used in war as weapons of war. Bloom and Matthess conclude that as long as basic social and economic context does not decisively change, specifically Nigeria's ongoing inability to achieve sustained economic growth and a degree of social justice, militant movements like Boko Haram will continue to rise again, and the dehumanization and exploitation of women will continue unchanged. So it's this last point that my research engages with more specifically, thinking about, well, what are the specific political, economic, and social processes, actors, and logics that are propelling gendered poverty in Nigeria, creating groups of and scores of women who are being exploited by Boko Haram. I ask specifically, where does gender inequality emerge from that make women so expendable and obtainable in Nigeria? My research takes the conclusions of the aforementioned scholars a step further by bringing them into conversation with political economic theory that situates this phenomenon within sort of broader crisis of social reproduction that's affecting Nigeria. I consider the ways in which the emergence of suicide bombers is implicated in a crisis of social reproduction and failures of neoliberal globalization to fulfill its intended promises in the context of Nigeria. I argue that the emergence of female suicide bombers is a direct consequence of the neoliberalization and the internationalization of state and class in Nigeria. The mechanics of my arguments basically are that neoliberalism has entailed the privatization of key institutions of social reproduction, including health, social welfare services, education, and more, in which previously protected spheres of social life are now commodified. This ultimately results in the marketization of citizenship, the intensification of gendered poverty, and the breakdown of the social fabric, especially in the northern region. In this environment, women become increasingly vulnerable to exploitation by Boko Haram. My research merges scholarship on terrorism and militancy with feminist political economic scholarship on social reproduction and neoliberalism to push theorizations of female militancy in new directions by linking this very local moment of social dislocation with national, regional, and international structures of exploitation. So why political economy? The reason why I think it's fundamentally important to link these new discussions on female militancy with political economy is to uncover the global national processes, structures, and social actors that have contributed to the crisis of social reproduction. This is important because uncovering the root causes of why this phenomenon is happening has material implications for the way we mobilize politically, economically, socially, and ecologically. They also have real consequences for the way neoliberalism and imperialism adapt to preserve their interests in the region. So trying to uncover the root causes helps us to create better, more systemic solutions to the cause, to the issue. So sorry, one last thing. Understanding the specific ways that neoliberal globalization has impacted Nigeria and Nigerian women is thus crucial to meaningfully and systematically addressing the issues of female militancy in particular and gendered poverty in general. So I emphasize that the process of integrating Nigeria into the world market has occurred in collaboration and confrontation with indigenous social and political forces, which in turn have reconstituted patterns of state and class, altering the penetration of neoliberalism from below. A shift is occurring away from the socialization of risk provision, so healthcare, pensions, unemployment insurance, education, and so on, towards a privatized system of self-help where people feel abandoned by the state and genuinely are. In this situation, the individual is made to fight for survival in the marketplace and to protect themselves against sickness and vulnerability, which becomes exceptionally harder in context of conflict and war. So, to look more specifically at the impact of neoliberalism in Nigeria, since the 1940s, oil has become a structural requirement for capital accumulation. Post-independence, Nigeria's southern delta, which contains the world's 10th largest oil reserves, became a geopolitical hotspot for petroleum extraction. In the 1970s, a heavily indebted Nigeria transformed from an agricultural-dominated economy to a petroleum economy in which multinational conglomerates like Shell worked with the state to employ exploitative practices to keep costs low. This exacerbated uneven development between the north and the south of Nigeria because the south was established as a center of accumulation, so its economic and political development were prioritized in order to create a favorable environment for foreign investment, while the agricultural-dominated north was left behind. These processes intensified with the emergence of neoliberalism in the 70s and the 80s, which subordinated labor and environments to finance imperialism through complex debt schemes of structural adjustment programs that were enforced by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. More specifically, in 1986, General Babangida implemented a series of stringent economic and political reforms in exchange for debt repayment assistance from the IMF, which included trade liberalization, elimination of labor and environmental regulations, privatization of public goods and state-owned industries, austerity across the board, and gutting of public sector wages and jobs, which ultimately led all in the service of export production to service foreign debt. In doing so, in employing these neoliberal policies, the state effectively retreated from welfare provisioning and instead invested in carceral apparatuses to protect the continual flow of oil from social unrest. So here we can see a real turn from the state engaging in welfare provisioning towards investing more and more into the military and security and surveillance apparatuses. These structural changes, however, have largely only benefited the foreign capital and domestic bourgeois classes, and they have adversely affected democratic rule, created crises of legitimacy for successive governments, caused irreparable harm to the environment, reduced the state's institutional capacity, and intensified socioeconomic gender inequalities, thereby generating a survivalist culture and politics of ethnic and gender mobilization. Moreover, a great rift has emerged in which the state gains unprecedentedly high revenues from oil sales, which are partially reinvested in southern infrastructure, while rates of unemployment, precarity, and poverty increase at alarmingly high rates, especially in the north, where, as Gonzalez writes, Muslim populations stand more attenuated relation to oil wealth. The poverty rate in the north is approximately 27%, the poverty rate in the north is approximately 75%, in stark contrast to the south, where the poverty rate is an estimated 27%. In 2008, the then governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Chukwuma Soludo, observed that the astronomical levels of poverty in the country have become a northern phenomenon. As we can see here in this chart that was taken from the Center of Global Development, since the 1980s, essentially since the implementation of neoliberalism. Poverty levels in Nigeria have varied significantly, with the North experiencing higher levels of poverty than the South, which consequently impacts the way Boko Haram is able to recruit and carry out its aims in the region. So at the local and individual level, these broad national and international structures and processes have engendered pervasive impoverishment, precarity, and insecurity for the vast majority, specifically women, engendering varying shades of reactionary resistance and identity politics. Boko Haram's strategic use of female suicide bombers emerges under conditions of growing inequality and the dispossession of populations of their social, political, and economic rights and means of livelihood. The emergence of suicide bombers speaks to the contradictory tendencies of global capitalism, which on the one hand promotes global economic integration and on the other hand promotes social disintegration through exploitative development and the extension of capitalist social relations of production that disrupt prior traditions, real communities, and existing forms of political associations, leading to the intensified commodification of everyday life, thereby triggering a crisis of social reproduction. The neoliberal state in Nigeria has been plagued with a declining capacity to deliver public goods, including basic survival needs like healthcare, housing, food security, clean water, and more, especially in regions suffering from water scarcity, like in the northern regions like Lake Chad. As a result, 44% of children under 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition, which is roughly about 14.5 million children who are at risk of dying or not developing into healthy adults. Underrepresented and neglected by the national government, women are estranged from the political processes because they're unable to influence the political economy that shapes their lives. The breakdown of the social safety net has prevented women from relying on the state or their traditional social networks. These neoliberal policies displace the cost, risk, and burdens of economic security from the state onto the individual, specifically women, who must now search for alternative sources of protection. This leads to hyper-individualism, in which each person, specifically women, is responsible and accountable for their own well-being, and successes and failures are perceived as personal failings rather than the result of structural oppression. With the elimination of the protective cover of democratic safeguards and faced with indefinite social dislocation, women are stripped of their basic human rights and dehumanized, thus becoming more vulnerable to exploitation and to turn to other forms of association to construct social solidarities and express a collective will. In the North, the crisis of social reproduction is politicized in distinctly gendered ways. In northern Nigeria, women are facing a lifetime of indefinite precarity and are doing what they can to transform their situations. Rebo writes, "They are motivated often to their deaths, not by here and now hardships, but by deeply human concerns for their own and their families' futures." As neoliberal globalization disrupts livelihoods, erodes social cohesion, and displaces entire social groups from their ancestral lands, the resulting disenfranchisement, marginalization, and social dislocation make women vulnerable to exploitation by Boko Haram. In conclusion, trying to meaningfully and systematically address the emergence of female suicide bombers in Boko Haram and protect generations of women from this violence must necessitate first addressing these issues that have been plaguing the Nigerian state for many decades, and thinking more specifically about how neoliberalism has failed to deliver its promises of economic growth within Nigeria. So I'm going to stop there because I am looking at the time and have just come to 20 minutes. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope I can connect with you through email. My email is sk5@yorku.ca. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Take care.